Okay, thank you. Well, welcome everyone. I think we have an excellent start for our first session, which is Saudi Vision 2030, 1 year later. I'm very pleased to welcome two economists, one business owner, one political scientist, all women, who I think we're all well positioned to look at both the macro and the micro aspects of this reform agenda underway. I'm going to start with just asking, I'll introduce our panelists and then ask each of them to give us kind of a very short 1 minute, what do you think is kind of the greatest obstacle to the economic reform agenda and what might be an asset? So to my immediate left is Khlood Aldukheil, who is Managing Director of Aldukheil Financial Group and President of the National Committee of Statistics in Saudi Arabia. Then we have Alia Moubayed, who's Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and also formerly Head of Research for MENA at Barclays Bank. So she's been following the region for a long time, and I think will have a good insight for us. And then in the end, we have Elena Ianchovichina, who is the lead economist for the Middle East and North Africa in the Office of the MENA Chief Economist at the World Bank. And Elena has also been doing some very interesting research on the region, work on unhappy development, work on productivity, and many of the challenges specific to youth and labor markets. So if I could start with you, Khlood, and just your very kind of brief reaction, what's the biggest obstacle standing in the way of this reform of Vision 2030 specifically to be successful, and what's its greatest asset?
Okay. Thank you, Karen. I first want to thank you for inviting us to speak here, and I already feel the power with all the females here. It's a very difficult question because there might be a lot of challenges, but I try to narrow it down to one challenge, which is, I say, the really lack of qualified human resources who have the knowledge and skill to actually affect the change of the vision. This is the challenge.
A people problem.
Yes, it's a resource problem, a knowledge, skill. Yeah, it's a challenge just because the magnitude of the transformation is really huge. I personally think it's an amazing plan. Of course, I speak from the private sector, so I will have more criticism than positive things to say. But really, we believe that the plan is excellent. Our only fear is that, is it too big, too fast, for the size of the private sector to digest? The most important thing, I mean, we have the plans, we know what needs to be done. The most important thing is to really get the people on the ground to do it. So it's really knowledge and qualified resources, and not financial human resources. This is the biggest
asset?
Okay, so the most important asset is probably the gist of this transformation is, let me say that, you know, Saudi has always had economic development plans. And I see this National Transformation Plan as an amalgamation of really all these plans into one excellent plan. This comes with a very clear political will to implement. So the biggest opportunity here is that there is a real demand that's coming up with this change, which is really affected by this real unparalleled political will.
Thank you. Okay, Alia, what's standing in the way?
Well, I think what stands in the way sometimes when we look at reform is that those who design reforms are actually those sometimes who stand in the way of it. And I mean, I was just in Riyadh last week, and when you ask this question to even the Saudis who are there in ministries, I think what they say is, number one, is communication is a challenge, is really how to translate sort of this very sort of ambitious, really well explained into a layman's language, so that basically you have the buy-in from anybody on the street, and particularly that actually in the context of Saudi Arabia, I mean, there's a very vibrant, I'd call it, virtual opposition, which is in social media, etc. So the communication even becomes even harder because you really have to have the messaging. But I think we've seen a lot of improvements on that front. Having said that, I think the opportunity is really sort of the global changes around Saudi Arabia regionally, is that this plan has, given that it is adapting to a changing environment, it will provide an opportunity always to have a flexible sort of policy making tool. And I think it was designed, and we'll talk about this maybe later on, not too rigid, but really to be able to evolve as the challenges, both regionally and globally, shape up the agenda for Saudi. I think that's a great opportunity for having done it this way.
Thank you. Elena?
Well, I think the main challenge and the main focus should be on the human factor in all of this. I think that paying attention to all aspects that relate to not only the skills that the workforce has, but also institutions and how institutions will have to change, and changing the mindset all at the same time in order to implement successfully the vision, which is very ambitious and shifts priorities in the right direction in general, is going to be a challenge. And here I want to go back to the research that we have done on countries that have gone through similar experiences. On one hand, we can look at the assets that Saudi Arabia has, and the major asset that they need to bring up to par with the rest is the skills of the economy, the institutions that need to change in order to support the development of the private sector and the non-oil and boost up non-oil growth. And going back to the human resources, I think in the case of Saudi Arabia, they present both opportunities and serious challenges. And it depends on the scenario that comes out of all of this. If the private sector growth picks up, and the education, the quality of education improves to equip the young entrants into the labor market with the skills needed by the companies, then we will have a very positive spiral of growth, and actually which would enable the realization of the vision and the goals set by the vision. However, if the private sector doesn't pick up in terms of growth and policies that boost its growth, or education lags behind and the skills are not there for Saudi workers to really be employed, we would have missed opportunities, and then that would pose a risk to actually achieving any of the goals. So I think the key is to coordinate, manage expectations, and develop rules that can allow policymakers to shift course depending on the challenges posed by the global environment, as well as domestic challenges as they come along. And one final thought, because we don't have time in this first part, is on changing norms. This is important because we have seen the tremendous progress made in terms of educating young Saudi women. But we also know that unemployment rates among women are very high, close to 35%, and labor force participation rates are lowest in the world. So what it tells us is that the huge investments made in educating and creating human capital are wasted, and returns are not being realized. So looking at some of the obstacles, and there are many, and I don't intend to go into them, just pointing out to the slower pace of changing norms and supporting women's participation and giving them, empowering them in a sense to shift priorities and reach out and realize their aspirations. That happens much slower than reforms on the ground in terms of policy reforms that are implemented. So there might be reforms that encourage participation, but that participation doesn't come along because of the slower changing in the mindset. And I think this is the area that needs to be carefully looked at.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to shift, actually. You're all going to get a lot more time to speak. So you might have noticed on your tables we've passed out some question cards. I'm going to ask each of our panelists a more specific question related to their area of expertise, and then we'll save time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question while the conversation goes on, go ahead and write it down, save it, and someone will come around and collect them, and we'll save a good at least 15 minutes of discussion at the end of our session. If you don't mind, I'd like to go to Alia first.
Sure.
Alia, I want to get a little bit more into the details of kind of your assessment of the current condition of the Saudi economy. We've got low growth, we've got deficits, we've got low oil prices on the horizon. No one's really expecting a great change there, and lots of new debt. How would you assess the government's plan to create new sources of revenue, especially in the non-oil sector, as Elena mentioned? The goal for the National Transformation Plan, the 2020 goal, is essentially a fourfold increase in the non-oil sector in GDP. And this, from a political economist you all probably know, Stefan Hertog, has said this is the equivalent of increasing the tax rate to OECD levels to generate that kind of government income. That would be the kind of bulk of government revenue you would have to find somewhere, presumably not in personal income tax. So where's it going to come from, you know, and how do you see the reality of these changes coming forward?
Sure. I mean, there's no doubt that the Saudi economy, I mean, since the start of the sharp fall of oil prices at the end of 2014, has been sort of experiencing a very serious external shock, to which now we're still sort of seeing the ramification, despite the fact that since the mid-2016, we started sort of getting the plans outlined in the Saudi Vision 2030, but also the budget 2017, which has laid out in more details and has allowed the government to start implementing many of its measures. So basically, it's an economy that is still reacting to a deep shock. So this is why we have a significant slowdown in growth. I mean, growth has faltered from 4.4% in 2015 to 1% in 1.4% almost in 2016. And we're expecting still in 2017, because we had sort of still the effects of these sharp cuts in government spending, but also the holding back of the allowances until they were reversed a couple of weeks ago, really a shock both to consumption and investment. So even growth in 2017 is actually expected to probably go even lower than 0.5. So I think for a lot of us, at least economists, we're writing off 2017 even as a year for a potential recovery. But also this is not only because the fiscal policy, we're going through this period of fiscal adjustment that has been imposed by strategic choices that the government has made, but of course there's also the OPEC agreement, which has imposed important sort of drag by cutting oil output, and therefore in 2017 actually, and I'm looking here at Jean-François, who's the specialist here, that probably we'll see even further cuts in 2017, so probably we'll have a negative growth in the oil sector. So that's a very important immediate challenge, and maybe this is what just maybe because everybody probably wants to hear, I mean, or comment on the reaction on the recent decision to sort of reverse the allowances from by King Salman, sorry, is basically probably this is the kind of policy flexibility I was trying to talk about, in the sense that in front of this very sharp sort of slowdown in the economy, there was a reassessment of, I mean, how best is it for us to reach our goal? Is it best to kill growth and go into sort of a deterioration of our debt to GDP, fiscal deficit to GDP? Or is it better that, okay, maybe have still another big deficit in 2017, but rather sort of give back, let consumption come back to this? So I think in 2017, what is interesting is that you are going to see this sort of policy adjustment that is recognizing the severity of the growth slowdown, but is more comfortable with the fiscal policy choices in terms of the savings that the government has done in 2016, and therefore trying to be more relaxed in terms of sort of pursuing the remainder fiscal adjustment objective. But that doesn't mean that this is likely to continue. I think 2018 will be a very important turning point for Saudi Arabia for many reasons. For probably, I mean, the return of a more expansionary fiscal policy. As we heard, there's a 200 billion Saudi riyal sort of private sector stimulus that is in the pipeline for the next 3 years. But at the same time, there are also a continuation of sort of the growth stifling measures, whether it's an addition of a VAT tax or the excise taxes, etc. But also, more importantly, sort of the beginning of what Dr. Saleh just mentioned, really sort of this a train of privatization and deregulation in many sectors that could also attract FDI. So I think, yes, we are in a period where growth has slowed down. We're still sort of managing large fiscal and external deficit, but I think this is only momentary, and probably 2018 will be a turning point, and we can discuss more the details.
I want to follow up a little bit. I mean, there is this goal to, get out of the deficit situation by 2020. I mean, you can't really do that by borrowing so much, having this, rising debt to GDP ratio, and at the same time running this deficit. I mean, how is this debt going to be serviced? And some of it comes due pretty soon, 2026, right?
Yeah, but I mean, look, Saudi Arabia is a G20 country. Its total debt to GDP, even now, is at around less than 15%. I mean, it's compared to like more than 100% in almost the majority of the main G7 countries. I think that doesn't mean that we should keep on borrowing. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying that Saudi Arabia has the fiscal space, but that only re-emphasizes the importance of continuing the pace of reform. That doesn't mean that we should stop and keep on borrowing. Actually, with oil prices even at around $50 a barrel, and if we assume that this is the level of production around 9.8 to 10.1, I mean, that range of production, you are going to have a deficit of around 7 to 8% of GDP. And liquidity in the banking system in Saudi Arabia has actually improved. We've seen sort of loan-to-deposit ratios soften a little bit, but also but what we haven't seen, of course, is the private sector sort of appetite for credit growth to come up. And I'm sure Khlood will say more about it. There's still this sense of confidence that the private sector has not regained after these sharp cuts last year. And I think Saudi Arabia, like Russia, like any sort of big emerging market country with a very sort of a major producer of hydrocarbon, as long as you are keeping your reforms and doing it in a more transparent manner. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, tomorrow Saudi Arabia actually will announce for the first time in its history, will start publishing quarterly fiscal numbers. That's going to be very welcomed by the markets. I mean, Saudi is increasingly exposed to the markets that are watching carefully what the policy choices are. And the more you keep a momentum of reform that is credible, that you explain why you are backtracking and why you are adjusting, the more this will get reflected in your spread, and the more you will be able to borrow, but at attractive rate that will allow you to maintain a sustainable debt path. So I wouldn't worry. What I would worry really is about these more structural sort of challenges that both Elena and Khlood talked about, and which I completely agree with. I think the pace at which these other sort of second generation difficult reform in education, in institutions, these are that are important for productivity enhancement and maintaining non-oil growth at higher level. This is what is more important in the future to focus on.
I think she said everything. That was excellent. Thank you, Alia.
No problem.
I do want to move to Khlood. I think this is a nice transition for you. I know you had a comment on Elena's intervention in the beginning, but I'd like to hear from you as a person in the private sector, as a business owner. What do you want to see? What messages do you want to hear coming from the government right now? Alia mentioned this, the 2 trillion Rial PIF investment that's meant to boost growth within the non-oil private sector. What is that pipeline? What does it look like? If you are a business owner, you're waiting, you're looking for signals, what could be different that would be helpful to people like you?
Okay, Karen. First of all, there's so many exciting things that were said, and I do have to paint a little bit different background because I do have a little bit different opinion. I definitely agree that we have witnessed and are witnessing slow growth, but I really believe that this is self-inflicted, I don't want to say recession, due to the massive transformation that is taking place. Now, 12 months ago, this plan was announced, and from last May until now, I would need 6 hours to tell you about the things that happened. Definitely, we started with a shock when the government stopped its expenditures and slashed, and this is our main fiscal tool, really. It's government expenditure. We have a weak tax system, and the sovereign debt is just fairly new to us. So it's really the government expenditure that shocked everybody. This is number one, and probably almost destroyed the whole contracting industry, which is now being revived. So not only was there stop of payment to recalculate because of the budget, and then cancellation of future projects to reassess good projects. So really they were good objectives, but they kind of came very fast, and then you have slashing the purchasing power of consumers, and this caused, by September, a major slowdown in the and I think it's in the industry and in the economy, sorry. And, but I still say it's self-inflicted. What happened is, I'm in the private sector. I'm also part of the Chamber of Commerce, and we're very close. I do a lot of debt restructurings. And what happened is, in October, November, we started voicing out to the government, saying that, listen, first of all, there is this issue of the plan being out there without being discussed with the beneficiaries. Yes, it's a beautiful plan, but then they realized very quickly that we need to get the beneficiaries on board. And from October onward until today, Saudi is a massive workshop between the private and the public. Not 1 week passes without severe dialogue between both sides, and a lot of very, very good things are coming out of it. Now, even before this plan, you need to keep in mind that since King Abdullah 2006, Saudi started this whole internal reform. I can just give you an example in the financial sector. 80% of the financial regulations have just only been issued in the past few years. The companies law, I always say the companies law was last issued in 67, the new one was 2015. So you're talking about the new M&A regulation is right now in circulation, the bankruptcy law. So we're talking about major regulatory reform has just started in the past few years. So I call this a silent revolution. I say that Saudi Arabia is really reinventing itself, and this creates massive opportunities. Now, somebody said something about social. There's something you all know Saudi Arabia, and you all know GCC and the emerging markets, and Saudi, we always pride ourselves for our uniqueness, whether it's about women or integration or not having cinema or driving or all these issues that they always ask us. By the way, we're going to have cinemas soon, so no more for that question. And so actually in the past year, we've had a major transformation in this. Even that, if you visited Saudi Arabia last year and now, you wouldn't recognize it from the events and the quality and the people. We have now world-renowned pianists that come. We're going to have an opera house soon. So give us 2 years, and I think you're going to come for a vacation there. So sorry, go back to your question about the private sector. Sorry. So just to put things in perspective, the private sector actually is very small. When I say the private sector, let me give you some numbers. We're talking about 1.7 million institutions, of which only around, of which 900,000 are less than 10 employees. This is number one in terms of the number of institutions. So that's very, very small. The second thing is the number of you have 10 million workers in the kingdom, of which 8 million are foreigners. The Saudis are around 1.7, 1.8, of which 600,000 are women. So the whole Saudi private sector is 1.7. That's nothing. That's nothing. So we're trying to focus on talent, and this actually creates a lot of opportunity for the outside world to come and provide advisory and invest. That's what my main mandate is, but basically to promote investment. So we've always had challenges as the private sector before this whole transformation. Challenges like what? We had, for example, limited fundings, because although we have excellent banks only lend, profitable, good projects. So this whole segment of SMEs, which 90% of the economy is SMEs, was always out of the radar. This has completely changed. The company has dedicated now massive efforts, established new entities dedicated for SMEs, several funds, billions of dollars. So this is all taken care of, and we're just in the beginning. This is one. The second thing is we had in the private sector, we have weak management, and this is, I think it's linked to education and skill and all of that. We are owners, we establish our own companies, we have limited knowledge on how to manage. The issue about individuals and resources and finding right talent. The education in the whole region and in Saudi was very, very bad. I think this has been identified from the days of King Abdullah. I think the reform is in the way. Now we have so many international schools. I think education is on the right track, but that needs at least 10 years. We've always had issues with, visas and getting people in. We've had unfair competition. So this is basically what the private sector used to typically, these are the challenges. What are the challenges today with the transformation? For me, or for many in the private sector, is to re-establish the connection with the government at a different level and change their mindset. The government we've always been customers to the government, and we're not at equal footing. So if we're going to introduce public-private partner or privatization or PPP, you need to have at arm's length, and most of the conferences that are happening now with ministers, direct dialogue with investors, it's about how can we commercialize the relationship and how can we, and all of the issues are coming out on the table and we're discussing them. This is one. The other thing is the other challenge today that the private sector faces is, can we keep up with the pace? Now, this is a good problem to have. If we reach 20 or 30% of what we put, that's still good. So, okay, I mean, every industry you look at, whether it's healthcare. I mean, last week we were in Boston and we have so many investments in healthcare. I mean, the kingdom is going all over the world now promoting. And as Dr. Abdelaziz said, there's so much interest in the kingdom. So every industry you look at, whether it's telecommunication, healthcare, services, anywhere you look, there's an opportunity. Another big challenge, which is not being addressed, is the cost of this change. Unfortunately, and as the case may be, you have the whole government is working 24 hours, and you have all these charges, coming up on the private sector. Now, we voiced our concerns. Some of these charges are changed or reversed. I personally think reversing the salaries was an excellent gesture, which shows that if the regulation did not meet the intention, it will be changed. And actually, it demonstrates the communication, I think. And then finally, which every private sector wants, consistency in regulations. I mean, correct regulations and consistency in regulations. Unfortunately, we don't have that, but it's a price you pay for aggressive change. I think we have now decided to just go so fast that we will have some damage, but I still think that the opportunity is much, much greater than the costs.
I really like that you use the phrase, the silent revolution. I mean, I think World Bank researchers would see this as the institutional framework of the state for the economy, right? And you're right, there have been enormous new regulations in the financial sector, especially over the last couple of years. But do you see the bankruptcy law that's coming through, there is still no PPP law. I mean, these things are being talked about, but it becomes a sequencing and a timing issue, right? Yeah. So is this realistic to expect in the next year? Before there's 2 trillion riyals invested into the private sector.
Well, the bankruptcy law is in its final form. It was out last year and finished the consultation period, which is a very good exercise. And I think it should come out, yes, within a year. But that's not an issue, by the way, although it was all over the media. Of course, we need the bankruptcy law. But we need viable businesses, and even for the PPP, I mean, we already have a successful PPP started. So and yes, we will. It's a matter of time. Do we wait until we have the whole framework, and then no, we can't wait. We can't afford that. So we bring partners together. We develop what guidelines we can, and then things will follow. Definitely, it's even PPP regulations is just in the long list of many other detrimental and critical regulations, such as the bankruptcy law.
Great, thank you. All right, Elena, we're finally going to turn to you. I think there's still a lot kind of out there which we haven't touched upon. I did want to ask you, in terms of regional and even global economic development trajectories, how would you describe Vision 2030 and its tackling of the labor force dynamics and ambitions to create jobs for young people? It was mentioned in Dr. Sagar's speech, 70% of the population is under 35, essentially. This is a very young country, and job creation is incredibly important. We've also got, in the education sector, I find it really interesting. There's something like, 2/3 of people of Saudis are employed by the public sector, and of people who graduate high school, nearly 75% of them are pushed into university, which is great, but people are studying humanities. They're looking for that government job. And these things take a long time to change. It's made enormous progress just in creating so many universities over the last 15 years or so, but how do you prepare those people to take jobs, and jobs that they'll be productive at and happy in?
Exactly, and I think this has been showcased in other parts of the world, but I will start with your first question about the global context. And I want to start on a positive note, saying that with the Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia has an opportunity to actually shift directions at a time when almost all developed countries in the world and many of the emerging markets are actually facing challenges creating jobs. And this is because trends like automation, new technologies are eliminating whole classes of jobs and changing the nature of work. So these are issues, how to come up with directions for development that are going to be viable for the future and equip the young people with the skills they need to be successful in this future is a huge challenge everywhere. But Saudi Arabia has the advantage that because of having resources and because of shifting directions now, to actually equip the young people with the skills they need so that they complement the capital investments that are being made. So in a sense, instead of refurbishing an old house and making remodeling, you actually are building a new structure. And in that, there may be an advantage. Now, stepping back one layer down, you see that there are many challenges. And the challenges are just one which came out of the discussion here is that the private sector in Saudi Arabia is very small. And when we have a small sector that is growing very fast, even though the growth is fast and creates challenges in terms of reforms, the number of jobs created are not very many in absolute terms. But at the same time, the pressure to rationalize the public sector and make public sector jobs more productive, but therefore freeze public employment, will create sort of a pool of queue of young people queuing for jobs in the public sector, but waiting also for private sector jobs. And what we saw in other parts of the Middle East is that exactly this mismatch between the lack of private sector jobs and the fact that it was much more difficult to obtain a job in the government sector created angst and anger. And looking at the profile of the Arab Spring protesters, I want to link this to social unrest, is that they were mostly young men, educated, middle class or affluent, living in urban areas who were frustrated that they were better educated than their parents. They had higher hopes than the previous generation. And yet when they actually came out of school and wanted to be successful, they found very few opportunities. And I might add here that they felt that the opportunities were available for only few of them, while the rest were actually at a disadvantage, those without connections. And so this sense of unfairness and sense of perception of corruption through nepotism really created this motivation to go out and challenge the status quo. So it's a very gentle balancing act where it will involve focus on youth to address, managing expectations, timing of reforms, coordination of reforms, but also collecting data that is of different nature to monitor progress. Because when we started our work on the Arab Spring and the causes of it, I have to say we were puzzled by many things, and actually this is how our report is structured, addressing puzzles, because the economic statistics that are used to monitor progress weren't showing to us that there was something wrong. There were good development outcomes. The economic statistics only on labor were actually negative, but when you dig down in terms of perceptions and micro-level surveys, then you see the problems, and they pertain to certain groups that are captured in slow growth or they're captured in despair. And so I would suggest that also looking at building up statistical capacity in a direction that not only covers regular standard economic statistics, but collects perception data and collects it consistently so that it can be analyzed through panel methods and more systematically, analyze the findings, disseminate them, then there will be more of a debate on are reforms actually creating social change? Are they having support among the populations? And recognize that different groups within Saudi Arabia will have very different aspirations. The young differ from the old. Young women are different from older women. People living in smaller cities have different aspirations and outlook on life than those living in cosmopolitan centers. So creating this textured look through analysis of the situation will be able to fine-tune the steps that are made so that there is really more support for this huge and much welcome change that is coming.
Those are really important points. Khlood, you may have something to add to this because I know you're working on some of the government's efforts.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been for the first time more public opinion surveys that have been contracted by the government-related entities, as well as outside firms doing some of this work. What are they finding?
Yeah, I can say something about the statistics because this is also part of the transformation. I mean, the committee that I'm heading was just established in January to assist the government statistic agency, which itself was fully transformed only a year ago. Although it's been in existence for 40 or actually 50 years as a department in the Ministry of Economy, it has been spun off with its own authority and they have just actually launched last year an amazing statistical platform online, and I recommend that everybody go and see it actually. And their number one client actually is the international world market, which is interesting, and the number two, the government, number three, the private sector. In the private sector, I manage this committee, and we just started really. And our objective is to have an impact in transforming statistics and how we can promote the use of statistics to make decisions. So this is really all new, and hopefully very soon you will see better decisions.
And one important aspect, actually, even I think that is important to monitor. And in my recent discussion, even with some ministries in Saudi Arabia, was exactly that, looking at the examples in countries that have undertaken sort of these sweeping reform, particularly deregulation, liberalization. What's in the back of policymakers, what was interesting in Saudi, is to think, okay, so how will this have an impact on inequalities in society? Because that's also the concern that a lot of Saudis have, because they care about sort of a society that is evolving together, that we don't start having bigger division along sort of class or income distribution aspects. So this is also a very important, and here I think what Elena has said, and me having been a World Bank staff in the past, I think these kinds of sort of household surveys that allow to see how these reforms are impacting basically the socioeconomic balances in society are essential for supporting decision-making when they are undertaking such sort of critical transitions. And I think that would be great to see this happening in Saudi Arabia.
And to share the data with researchers,
yes, absolutely.
Too.
Next year we'll bring
the bank does
Next
it very
year.
well.
We still have a lot of time for questions, so if you have written any on your cards, we'll have someone who goes around and collects them. Raymond? I'm really impressed with I think the depth of the discussion we've had so far. We've had some very practical recommendations, policy-wise. Okay, someone has terrible handwriting. Let's see. Dr. Safai Hamed, you invested since the 1970s in several new industrial towns like Jubail and Tanbu, I think it's.
Yambua.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What role will they play in the 2030 plan, and how successful or not have they been so far? Anyone want to tackle that?
This is a very sort of energy-related question. I mean, maybe Jean-François has. I'm looking at him, but I think as part of the actually, if I'm not mistaken, 2030 plan, there is more emphasis on these two investments. And my understanding is that this is part of the sort of Saudi Aramco transformation plan, basically that is aiming at sort of creating more downstream linkages and certainly sort of building these cluster of industries that could basically support the objective of industrialization by sort of capturing the competitive advantage that Saudi has in the energy sector, obviously, the cheap feedstock and everything else. There are specialists here.
Anyone else want to add to that? I mean, these kind of pockets of new sectors are going to be important, but they're also maybe going to create these, tensions between, regional differences in where growth is accelerated.
Yeah. But I think what is new in 2030 vision, and I mean here I don't know what the private sector, because there is this sort of a clear sort of opting for an industrial policy, right? I mean, in the sense that trying to say, okay, we're going to pick winners. We're going to just focus on these sectors that we think sort of either will, probably strategically make sense for Saudi Arabia, because when we are looking at the defense industry, at basically the health sector, I mean, if you take your own cash flow, which is your balance of payment, and Saudi Arabia, and see where is the biggest sort of amount of capital or current outflows that Saudis pay to the rest of the world. These are the two biggest sectors, in addition, of course, to tourism. So it makes only sense that if your objective is actually to reduce your capital or your current payment to the rest of the world, that you develop or you do import substitution kind of industrial policy aimed at this element. Whether this will actually sort of work or not, there are different experiences. But I think the interesting thing that Saudi has decided to do is to adopt this local content program as part of the sort of whereby you create regulatory framework where you ask the private sector to have a minimum contribution that is either produced locally or a value added that is done locally. And this, if one looks at experiences, whether in Malaysia or Chile or Brazil, although done differently, they have contributed a lot to diversification and to building of the industrial base. So maybe picking winners or choosing or to support some sector may not be necessarily the wrong approach that is embedded in the strategy.
I have so many questions about that, but Elena wants to say something
just
first.
to add to that, I have to caution in terms of how these centers are thought of, because the experience in many places around the Middle East is that these zones or these centers don't work well because they're not built around a strategic comparative advantage. And when they were successful in other parts of the world, it was clear that they were overcoming a key constraint to private sector growth, as they did in China. And they were building on the abundance of cheap labor. Yeah. And so once they were created because they overcame a constraint, and they basically benefited from the abundance of labor, and labor was enabled to move to these cities where it was much easier to produce. Then the model was scaled up throughout the country, through many areas, and so growth picked up really fast. In Saudi Arabia, this could work if, however, there is a thought given on what are exactly the constraints to growth in the private sector now, to remove the constraints that matter in these zones, and to create incentives to move companies in based on market signals, because just choosing winners also can lead to very costly mistakes. Some successes, but mostly mistakes. It's like picking stocks. You may be successful several times, but consistently it's very hard to be right all the time, and enable backward linkages. Yeah. Enable also the acquisition of skills. So actually these zones employ Saudi nationals. Because what we see in Jordan and in other places around the Middle East, there is a lot of workers who are not Jordanian workers. They are coming from East Asia, and they're employed in these factories that are located there.
Yeah, I was going to ask, really, this comes back to the question about productivity, and one of the struggles in Saudi Arabia has been, and a barrier in the private sector, is that it's actually a very expensive place to do business. And even though there's this supply of cheap labor, it doesn't necessarily, it creates a kind of negative cycle, right? Where you're not incentivized to increase productivity because it's easier just to pay someone very, very low wages to do a menial kind of work. So the traditional kind of manufacturing model of the East Asian economies is not going to work in Saudi Arabia, right? I mean, don't we all agree that? Yeah.
I don't, can I comment?
Yes, please.
I don't think I agree that it's costly to do business in the private sector. I think the issue is the skilled labor. I mean, if we have skilled labor, we'll pay. And we've always had an issue with productivity, and I don't know whether you want, it's a combination of factors, whether you want to say the laid-back culture or lack of responsibility or the skills or lack of motivation in the work environment. Now, this is a big thing, a work environment, and they've established a whole, actually, government entity responsible for improving work environment. Because it's true, in the end, I mean, you have to be happy to produce, and you have to have link and connection to what you're producing. So productivity is a very, and how to measure it and all that's a very complex thing. The stereotype is that government jobs are less productive because of the working hours and all of that. But now actually it's different. If you go to ministries now, they're working, and some of them working long hours, and you go 8 o'clock, everybody's there. And so, and most of the government now, everybody knows they're working around the clock. So the private sector is, to survive in the private sector, you have to be productive. And I think now the shift in terms of the cost of labor has changed. Now the foreigners are much more costly, and they build it like that with the Saudization and the labor charges and the iqama and the medical, and all of these charges have really shifted the balance. I mean, I'm in the advisory field for 20 years, and we've always relied on expats really that have the knowledge, and now they've become much more expensive for me. I'd rather invest in Saudis and train them, because you have, you know, really much less cost now.
All right, we have a question about technology incubators for startups. I just wrote about this, so yes. Where are the innovation centers in Saudi Arabia? What are they doing? Anybody know about that?
Well, I know a few. I'm not a tech person, but anyways, it is an area that they've, maybe Dr. Abdulaziz or somebody from the audience would know more, but they've shed the light, and there are a couple of programs that they've launched. I don't want to make mistakes, but I think I know that King Fahad has an incubator. I know that King Abdulaziz Institute has an incubator. That's what I know, but there are many other government dedicated funds to incubate. You're talking about
yeah. I mean, it kind of goes back to this issue of picking
but
winners again too,
it's not just
right?
technology. It's not just technology. There is a dedication for entrepreneurship and innovation and SME. I mean, a whole agency under the Ministry of Commerce has been established, headed by Dr. Ghassan.
Like $4 billion or something.
A huge amounts just to really fund, educate, train, regulate, all of this.
Alia, you had a comment?
No, I'm saying that, I mean, this is a big focus, again, of because the point is basically that you want to support a lot SMEs, but you also want to create this sort of new wave of provide financing for these new wave of innovators who are seeing a whole movement across the Gulf, but also across the Middle East. I mean, where startups are becoming increasingly more sort of à la mode, if we may say, but also it is creating a lot of jobs. It is providing connectivity across the region. It is allowing basically increasing trade in services among the countries in the region. And I think there is here also a regional sort of domino effect. I mean, we have seen the UAE in 2015 sort of develop a very ambitious innovation strategy to create the ecosystem for that. I think now we are seeing this in Bahrain, in Saudi, etc. So there is a whole movement towards basically strengthening the enabling environment for startups and for innovation. And that can only support the objective of the diversification.
We're getting a lot of questions that are really probably more suited to our second panel. But there was one question about the government's goal or target of creating 60,000 jobs within the third sector, the NGO sector. And I know they'll have more to say about this in our second session. But you know, again, this kind of goes back to the regulatory revolution, right? There is a new NGO law in Saudi Arabia. There are efforts to expand the space, but is this realistic in terms of job creation? Anybody familiar with these changes? Yeah.
No,
No.
I mean, I could say that most of the
Saudi
put everything on me. Most of the objectives we have set for ourselves are targets that are really disconnected from the reality. Let me put it this way. However, that said, I'm a very positive and optimistic person. I think it is definitely in the right direction. And even if we reach half of that, someone mentioned that the private sector, because I said it was small and mentioned that, given it's small, there's limitation creating jobs. Absolutely, that's correct. However, there are new industries that are coming about. I mean, just the privatization in itself, let alone the PPP or other government initiatives, the magnitude of opportunity available for new investment is huge, and all of this requires new jobs that never existed before. So jobs, yes, will be created, but I think the challenge is, do we have the know-how? And we do have the money, but do we have the know-how, the ability to organize, the proper corporate governance, and all of this to implement it in the time that we said we will? Now, if you tell me we have double, triple the time, then I'd say, of course, we're going to do it. But it's the magnitude and the time, but it's not rocket science. I mean,
yeah. I have a friend in Saudi Arabia who's trying to start an art gallery that also has a cafe, and she's told me of the troubles of trying to get licensing because nobody understands what kind of business that is. Well, are you a restaurant, or are you, what are you? Are you selling art? Or, well, no, it's just a space. It's a social space, and these are new challenges, right, of being categorized by the government and then the government regulating these spaces, and that might be.
I have to say something.
Okay,
so we are very, very good at complaining. Very, very good at complaining, actually. And yes, this is a classic story, such as the story as we don't get visas, blah, 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 and all of that, that there are so many, the classification to get your commercial registration has not changed for many, many years. That's correct. And a lot of, let's say, business setups were not properly mapped to the right definition. This is absolutely correct. But they didn't stop people to start, actually. I always say the sentence, market imperfection creates opportunity. Actually, Saudi Arabia was one of the best places to make businesses because it was so easy, because of the least regulations or regulations that were not implemented. I know that's not a good thing, but in the end, in the end, you had a lot of people that had businesses. Now, we are in a correction phase, and this is why you see a lot of people. Yes, we are. My problem here, actually, or my challenge, that I say that the correction is happening while companies are in the middle of their businesses. We don't have proper transfer for those that now. Saudi Arabia is an excellent place to start business, new businesses. But if you're in the middle, trying to survive now, these changes, trying to keep up, this is where the challenge is. Yeah.
Elena, you had a comment?
Yes, I want to take this a bit in a different direction to connect it with the fact that this is essentially a new social contract. And it is very different from the old one, which relied mostly on redistributing rents and having a lot less engagement of citizens in social and political life. So I see the NGO move, or the move to support NGOs, an essential part of giving space for more participation. Because as citizens become more active as economic participants, they will also naturally have more interest in involving themselves in the politics of the place and in social life. So all of these organizations can both create jobs, but they also can be a vehicle for enabling productive participation during this enormous reform and a time of change.
I forgot to mention, sorry, because the question was about NGOs. One of the main pillars, actually, of the transformation is to create the identity of the Saudi individuals. So this NGO, this pillar, or whatever they had called it, program, to increase the people's participation in NGOs is actually to satisfy this.
Well, I mean, it's engagement of civil society, but also this kind of state-led reinforcing notion of Saudi identity, right?
Yeah.
And those two things are not necessarily always aligned. Alia,
you can put it in different ways. I mean, there's, NGOs, under NGOs now you could foundations, so the whole creative sector. I mean, actually, if you look in the region, in many economies, all the design, the creativity are under the NGO sort of legal framework, and they create jobs, absolutely, because, and I think the opportunity in Saudi, because in Saudi you have pockets of high net worth that can donate a lot to these sectors, and they can actually support them to go in different directions, whether to participate socially, politically, but also to be creative, or to act like an accountability mechanism to monitor, for example, the Saudi Vision 2030. I think there are a lot of possibilities and for tapping this new sector that is evolving, but also mobilizing the sort of potentially the resources that is there and that was looking for the right venue to support and to create more jobs.
I think we'll have lots more to say on this in the second session. We did have a question, more technical. What will be the biggest Vision 2030 milestone this year? So if we're looking for picking a winner, do we see, progress on reducing the deficit? Do we see progress on job creation? Do we see progress on passing through more subsidy eliminations?
I mean, on the economy, definitely, I think the continuation of reforms of the energy subsidy is essential. It has been a major sort of contributor to the reduction of the deficit last year. And if another if this continues, you have we are moving from around 30 billion or 29 billion Saudi riyal of saving last year to around 70 billion this year. This is quite important for the objectives of meeting the targets for the Ministry of Finance. But I think also an important milestone is to start seeing basically sort of the regulatory and legal framework for greater public-private participation and creating sort of a level playing field, a competitive framework for further privatization down the line. That's a very important milestone in order to make sure that the private sector actually grabs the benefits and there is a fair playing field for everybody in this process.
And we should expect more debt issuance?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah? Yes. Any other milestones you think would be?
I hope, I think it's not about the numbers, it's about the people. I hope this year the milestones we see is a major social change, and hopefully with women. This is one. And I know taxes are coming, I know more costs are coming, subsidies are going to be removed, taxes, and I really hope that this is slowed down to the pace, they're balanced, it's slowed down to the extent that the private sector can grow while digesting and adapting to the new framework.
Elena, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think that I agree with both my colleagues here that it's important to keep reforming the areas which have contributed previously and heavily to building the deficit, especially after the shock in 2014 to oil prices, and also to keep hoping that there is social change and that people embrace reforms, and that there are many areas where I know the government wants to realize efficiencies and that these are actually captured and that results are shared, so that I know that there is a lot of need for disseminating progress reports, and these quarterly reports are one way, but I'm sure there are many other ways to inform the public through the media on areas that need more attention, areas that are progressing, and to really move on with enabling the private sector growth, because I think that this switch in engines is going to be hard. It has proven hard for many places, but I think I'm optimistic in the case of Saudi Arabia, where there is commitment, and consistent commitment by the leadership is a very important factor. We've seen that in many places because of too many political instability, as actually we have shown it in our research, is one way which discourages actually high quality foreign investors to move into countries. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, we have stability, there are clear rules, and if those are consistently applied, there will be companies setting up shop and then creating jobs through the large enterprises, not only SMEs. We know SMEs are important and they will continue growing, but also in terms of the high quality jobs that will be hopefully picked up by educated young Saudi people.
And maybe the element actually that will also characterize the 2017 is an element for which the government has been quite actually criticized about last year while front-loading a lot of the measure. And that is being more attentive to the issue of mitigating the impact of these reforms. And sort of, I think already in February and now with the Hisab al-Muwatin, the citizen account, is an important really sort of milestone of this sort of objective, in making sure that the objective of having an inclusive, or as you mentioned, sort of a not a very aggressive rapid transformation, but one that carries with it everybody and that targets better basically the social safety nets that have been largely inefficient over the last few years. So hopefully with this also in place and moving towards sort of more cash transfers, that will only improve the efficiency and ensure that the redistribution impact is lessened or mitigated.
So I think you've given a pretty glowing assessment. I have to say, I thought we'd be a little more critical, but I think we've also identified some of the weak points, and it really comes down to people, where we started the conversation, which is very interesting. So I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking this panel. I think you did an excellent job.